Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Monday, June 10th, 2024. All right, first thing I want to mention today, at the end of this week, I'm going on vacation. I'm going to Australia for 2 weeks to visit with my wife's family. We're bringing the kids, and I'm taking off the whole time, so there will not be a show. I'm going on a little hiatus for 2 weeks. During that time, antiwar.com, of course, is still going to be updated. Kyle Anzalone will probably be doing a lot of extra writing, and you could go over and listen to his show, Conflicts of Interest. He goes over a lot of the same news as me, and he has very good analysis and everything. I just wanted to mention that up top because I know I've been talking about it at the end of the show, but I know a lot of people don't make it to the end. But anyway, this week is a normal week. There's going to be 5 shows, so here we go. Let's get started with the news. U.S. drone flights over Gaza supported Nusrat massacre. So Israel received intelligence support from the U.S. in its Saturday operation in central Gaza's Nusrat camp that killed over 200 Palestinians and freed 4 Israeli hostages. So this was the big news over the weekend. Just a huge operation in the middle of this very crowded area of Gaza. And this intelligence support from the U.S. included information provided by U.S. drone flights over Gaza. The U.S. began flying MQ-9 Reaper drones over Gaza days after October 7th and deployed special operations forces to Israel, demonstrating, really showing that U.S. military support for Israel goes beyond just giving them weapons. I mean, flying drones over Gaza is very, was a big step. This is goes to show how involved the U.S. is in this. And the Washington Post reported that a team of U.S. Special Operations soldiers and intelligence personnel based at the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem provided the intelligence support. Besides the drone flights, the U.S. provided communications intercepts, and Israel also received intelligence support from the U.K. And I know the U.K. has also been flying drones over Gaza. So local residents said the Israeli special forces who carried out the raid were disguised as displaced Palestinians from Rafah, and others entered the camp in an aid truck, according to some eyewitnesses. Israel denied that they used an aid truck, but Israeli media reported that the Israeli soldiers who were involved were meant to blend in as Arabs, kind of going in undercover. And then as they were entering and going to find the hostages, Israeli warplanes, they just unleashed a bunch of airstrikes on this area and lots of casualties in this. Do you see this picture? This is just one child being treated. I mean, he looks like he's like 2 years old or something, being treated for wounds at the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Hospital. And if you look through the pictures, I mean, this is from Reuters. I was looking through their pictures from Gaza, and it's so many children in these hospitals and just horrific sights. And according to Gaza's health ministry, 274 Palestinians were killed in the attack on Nusrat, and 678 were wounded. 678 were wounded. So that's nearly 1,000 casualties, according to the Palestinian health ministry. Gaza's media office said that 64 of the dead were children and 57 were women. The total death toll in Gaza since October 7th has surpassed 37,000 now. So Israel claimed that it killed less than 100 people in the assault, while the U.S. said that it did not know how many people died. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan celebrated the assault and also acknowledged that innocent people were killed. Sullivan said, quote, "We, the United States, are not in a position today to make a definitive statement about that. The Israeli Defense Forces have put up one number. The Hamas-run Gaza Health Ministry has put out another number. But we do know this. Innocent people were tragically killed in this operation," end quote. And then Hamas also alleged that the Israeli attack killed 3 other Israeli hostages, including an American citizen. And they put a video out of 3 corpses that they said were Israeli hostages, but They were unidentifiable from the videos. That's according to Middle East Eye. I did not see the video myself. And then there's also rumors and that Israel might have launched this attack from the pier that the U.S. built off Gaza. There was a video of a helicopter landing near it. And I read some reports that said they evacuated the hostages to the beach near the pier. So we'll see. I'm going to try to kind of look more into that, see if there's more evidence of that. Because, I mean, if they really did use an aid truck to go in, I mean, you talk about like a Trojan horse, this whole pier project, there's always the thought that it could have very nefarious purposes, and it has been reattached to the shore of Gaza. But, I mean, the Reaper drones, again, it just really goes to show how involved the U.S. is in this. All right, the next one here. Rescued Israeli hostage says, our greatest fear was Israeli planes. So this is an interview of one of the Israeli hostages who was freed by the IDF in this operation that killed all those Palestinians. He had some interesting things to say. Basically what he said, and we've heard this from other hostages who were released either in the exchanges, and say this, that the things that they feared the most was the Israeli bombing. So he said, quote, our greatest fear was the IDF's planes and the concern that they would bomb the buildings we were in. I was a soldier myself once, but the feeling that it could be our own bombs, our own planes, that this is what would kill us, that's very scary and very anxiety-inducing, end quote. So he was asked if he said he made peace with the fact that he might be killed, and that his greatest fear, and they're just kind of reaffirming in the question. So your greater fear was from IDF activity, correct? Was the question. And he said, quote, from the IDF, we decided for ourselves, the whole gang of us together, that we wouldn't resist the hostage takers and wouldn't cause conflicts. We respected each other and we were calm. We weren't worried that they'd do something to us all of a sudden. We didn't object to anything, so I wasn't afraid that they'd kill me. But I knew that if they got the order to kill us, they'd do it instantly. Wouldn't think twice. Still, I knew it wasn't like in other cases where they just killed for no reason. The people who kept watch over us were really just keeping watch and wanted to make sure the exchange with their own people and made sure we were okay. And so did we, end quote. And so what he says now is they got to get the hostages back under any condition, is what he says. I'll read his whole quote. He said, quote, what needs to be done is getting all the hostages back at any price and under any condition. That is what's most important now. Human life is above everything. I won't tell the IDF or the government what to do. They're grown up enough to know what they need to do. I'm just waiting for them to really bring everybody back. That's my only hope, and I haven't lost hope, end quote. So we know Netanyahu is not willing to end this thing to get the hostages freed. So, and I think this has probably emboldened him, this operation, even if it did kill 3 more Israeli hostages. I mean, it was kind of like a media frenzy over the weekend, in Israeli media, like celebrating this, and a U.S. media, even though so many civilians were killed in this thing and children. So we'll see. But the next one here, we'll see how this affects things. Gantz quits the Israeli war cabinet and calls for elections. So Benny Gantz, the chair of Israel's National Unity Party, announced on Sunday that he was quitting the emergency government and war cabinet that was formed after October 7th and called for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to set a date for new elections. Gantz said Netanyahu was preventing Israel from achieving true victory in Gaza. He said, quote, I call on Netanyahu, set an agreed election date. Don't let our people be torn apart, end quote. The National Unity Party's exit does not force elections, since Netanyahu's coalition still holds 64 out of 120 seats in the Knesset. They still have a majority, a slim majority, but that's what they had before October 7th. Gantz called for others to join him, including Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, who is a member of Netanyahu's Likud party, but he recently called out the prime minister. He publicly called out Netanyahu over his lack of a clear long-term plan for Gaza. Gantz's move comes a few weeks after he threatened to quit if Netanyahu did not agree to a list of demands by June 8th. he had some pretty strong demands there. One of them was that he wanted the establishment of a U.S. European Arab Palestinian administration to manage civilian affairs in Gaza alongside Israeli security control. So his plan is long-term Israeli military occupation with the U.S. and Europe involved in some sort of civil administration. Haaretz reported that Gantz informed the White House of his plans to quit several days ago and asked for the U.S.'s opinion. U.S. officials told Gantz that while they did not intend on intervening in Israeli politics, they noted the fragile state of the hostage ceasefire talks and thought his departure will only lead to added pressure from the U.S. on Netanyahu. I mean, if the U.S. is supporting the operation like it did over the weekend, I mean, give me a break that they're really pushing for a ceasefire if they're supporting something as big as that. And then they pretend like they don't really know how bad it was. I mean, man. Earlier this year, Gantz visited the U.S. and he met with several high-level officials as part of a trip that was not approved by Netanyahu. So Gantz is kind of, their guy in Washington right now. The Haaretz report said that the U.S. views Gantz as their preferred interlocutor in the war cabinet, but he's not in the war cabinet anymore, but they did prefer to deal with him. Many in the U.S. consider Gantz to be Netanyahu's moderate opposition, but one of Gantz's critiques of Netanyahu is that he did not go into Rafah soon enough. That was one of the things he said when he came out with this whole thing. So we'll see how this changes things. Again, this could just make Netanyahu dig in even more because Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, those guys who have been threatening to quit, and that would force elections if they quit. If they implement the ceasefire deal, they're saying that they'll quit. They seem happy right now. I didn't write anything about it, but I saw comments from them about Gantz leaving. They're like, okay, he's gone. We're good now. Let's, we're going to keep supporting Netanyahu. It was essentially what they said. So now they have even more leverage. All right, so the next one here, Netanyahu to address Congress on July 24th. So this article is from Kyle. He wrote this up on Friday. Congressional leaders confirmed the Israeli prime minister will address a joint session of Congress on July 24th. Netanyahu's speech to the U.S. legislature comes as Israeli forces have killed tens of thousands of Palestinians with American weapons. So it was a bipartisan invitation that he got from the House Speaker Mike Johnson and from Chuck Schumer. Despite Schumer recently calling for elections in Israel, he said, "Our commitment to Israel transcends, any individual leaders here." So we've seen some opposition to this. Bernie Sanders is one. He's come out very strongly against Netanyahu, although he's probably still going to endorse Biden, I would guess. But he's calling Netanyahu a war criminal and everything. And I saw we have an article on the lower part of the page that even Nancy Pelosi said that she didn't want Netanyahu to come speak. But he's going to come and deliver his address. All right, so the next one here, Ukrainian NGO Smears antiwar.com. So a State Department-linked Ukrainian NGO published a study on June 6th that listed hundreds of individuals and organizations that oppose aid to Ukraine in an effort to smear them as spreading Russian propaganda. The NGO, it's called texty.org.ua. That's what I've seen it named as. It's a URL, but that's the name that you see in its studies. But anyway, they listed antiwar.com and several of its staff members, including Eric Garris, who's my boss, who's the director of antiwar.com. He founded it in '95 with Justin Raimondo. Scott Horton, who's our editorial director, and Kyle Anzalone, who's our opinion editor, and he helps out with the news and everything as well. And many antiwar.com contributors. I was not mentioned. I kind of feel a little insulted that they didn't pick me. I mean, I write so much content for antiwar.com, but I was left out. And then organizations that we work very closely with were also named, including the Libertarian Institute, which is Scott and Kyle, and we share some of the same staff. And the Ron Paul Institute, which is Dan McAdams and Ron Paul, of course. And they contribute to us. We reprint our stuff. They use our stuff in the Liberty Report all the time. So they were named as well. And the American Conservative, which was also included in this list, reported that this NGO was co-founded by a guy named Anatoly Bondarenko, and he has worked as an instructor for a State Department program known as Tech Camp, which provides training for foreign journalists and activists. And the Tech Camp's website listed him as a trainer for a Ukraine program that brought together more than 60 local journalists, civil society, community leaders, and private sector partners in Eastern Europe, with the goal of helping to increase digital and media literacy. So someone who has worked for the State Department started this thing. And the title of the report is kind of funny. It's titled Roller Coaster from Trumpists to Communists: The Forces in the U.S. Impeding Aid to Ukraine and How They Do It. The study acknowledges that most of the people listed, quote, do not have direct, proven ties to the Russian government or propagandists, end quote. But it claims that, quote, the arguments they use to urge authorities to distance themselves from Ukraine echo key messages of Russian propaganda aimed at depriving Ukrainians of the ability to defend themselves with Western weapons and funds. And so they had all the organizations, they have little like pages on them, and they link to things that they call examples of anti-Ukrainian statements. And one of the things that they linked to was our news page for Ukraine, our regional news page for Ukraine, which a lot of this is just stuff that we run lower on the page from, other media outlets. A lot of it is articles that I write. So basically our news coverage of the war in Ukraine, they view as anti-Ukrainian. So other listed people and organizations are from across the political spectrum based on the title. You see that, including former President Donald Trump, all the way to Jill Stein, who's the Green Party presidential candidate now, and dozens of Republican members of Congress were named. And I mean, people that even voted for Ukraine aid up until like very recently. They named quite a few people here. And media outlets that we frequently link to on our front page, or, you'll see me cover their stories a lot here, were also listed, including Responsible Statecraft and The Gray Zone. And peace groups were also smeared, including people we work closely with, Code Pink, Veterans for Peace, World Beyond War, and many other peace groups. So if you get the time, you could go poke around this thing and look at their big graph here and see all the different names that are included here. And you'll see antiwar.com and the Libertarian Institute and Ron Paul. All of us, well, not me. Again, I wasn't named, but it's quite a few people. And, this is something we've seen. There's been a lot of these lists of so-called Russian propagandists, essentially enemies of Ukraine. The most infamous one, I forget the exact name of it, but it's known as the Ukrainian Kill List. It's a website that's in Ukrainian, and it lists people that they call enemies of Ukraine. And when somebody on that list gets killed, like Daria Dugina, who's the daughter of Alexander Dugin, who's a very well-known Russian nationalist philosopher, when she was killed, they labeled her picture. They put a big label across it that said liquidated. So that's kind of the extreme version of this. But this is something, anything out of line. Again, a lot of people on here, I mean, even Trump, he basically backed Speaker Johnson's whole Ukraine aid thing. And, anybody who steps just a little bit out of line gets thrown on this list here. All right, so the next one here, the U.S. announces a $225 million weapons package for Ukraine. So this one is from Kyle. He wrote Friday. So the Joe Biden administration announced a $225 million weapons transfer to Ukraine on Friday. The package includes ammunition for HIMARS missile launchers that Biden recently gave Kiev permission to use for attacks inside Russia. According to a Pentagon press release, the U.S. will transfer the weapons directly from U.S. stockpiles to Ukraine. Biden authorized the transfer through the Presidential Drawdown Authority, which Congress funded in the $95 billion foreign military aid bill passed earlier this year. So some of the other things in here, missiles for the Hawk air defense system, Stinger anti-aircraft missiles, again, ammunition for HIMARS, 155 millimeter howitzers and artillery rounds, armored personnel carriers, tow missiles, javelin and other anti-tank systems, small arms, demolition munitions, and things like that. So the weapons continue to flow. All right, the next one here, Macron, who looks like he's in trouble. We'll get to that in another story. But this story is about his plans to deploy troops to Ukraine. So on Friday, French President Emmanuel Macron said France was working to finalize a coalition of NATO countries that are willing to send troops to Ukraine to train Ukrainian forces, a step that would mark a huge escalation in the proxy war. During a press conference with Zelensky in Paris, Macron said Ukraine's request for NATO trainers was legitimate, and he downplayed the risk of escalation. He said, quote, "It's much more efficient and practical for certain capacities and certain conditions to train on Ukrainian soil. It's a legitimate request. We're going to use the coming days to finalize the broadest possible coalition," end quote. He added that several NATO countries have already agreed to the plan. And Russia has warned any French trainers that are deployed would be legitimate targets. But Macron downplayed it. I mean, he's just completely set on sending these troops there. He said, quote, "This is not deploying European soldiers on the front line. It is recognizing the sovereignty of Ukraine over its territory. Who would we be to give in to the invocations or threats of Russia," end quote. So Reuters reported on May 30th that France planned to initially send a few dozen troops to assess the training mission before sending hundreds of soldiers. And that was a report that said Macron might announce the plan. He didn't exactly do that. He said that they're still finalizing it. But again, this would just be a huge escalation, risk World War II. It risks nuclear war. It's completely reckless, and it would not help Ukraine win by any means. I mean, it would have no impact on the outcome of the war. All right, so the next one here, Macron calls snap election after far-right surge. So this article is from Politico, and so I know people usually point out, when we talk about European politics, what's considered far-right, that label kind of gets thrown around too much. But for these purposes, it's a political article about what's happening in France. And this is Marine Le Pen's party. And, they consider her far right. So what happened was there was European elections on Sunday for the EU Parliament. And the Marine Le Pen's party, what is it called? The National Assembly, the National Rally. They blew the Liberal Party, Macron's party, out of the water. So this is the National Rally is on course to win 31.5% of the vote, more than twice the 14.7% projected for Macron's Liberal Renaissance Party. So in a high-risk gamble to regain the political initiative, Macron bet that voters will turn back the far-right tide and show Marine Le Pen's National Rally cannot win at a national level. So Macron said, quote, "France needs a clear majority in serenity and harmony. To be French at heart is about choosing to write history, not being driven by it," end quote. So the strategy here seems to be he took a big hit. So he dissolved the lower house of parliament. The elections will start on June 30th. And there's a chance that the National Rally Party then gets a majority in that House of Parliament, which could be trouble for Macron's plans to send troops to Ukraine. It'll make it harder for him to do things. And then the way French, they have separate presidential elections, and the next one of those will be held in 2027. So apparently this article is saying Macron's strategies, he thinks that this might hurt Le Pen's momentum. I don't really see. I don't know. I mean, I feel like if they have a big win, then they're going to keep that momentum going. But I know Le Pen, I haven't paid much attention to her recently, but back when she was running in 2022, I mean, very skeptical of NATO, against arming Ukraine. So, this could have a big impact. What we've seen Macron doing for the past few months, past year or so, being so hawkish on Russia. This could change things. So we'll see what happens with these elections. All right, so the next one here, the U.S. and U.K. strikes in Yemen killed 16 civilians. So U.S. and British missile strikes on Yemen that were launched on May 30th killed 16 civilians and wounded 35 more, according to the Yemen Data Project. And the Yemen Data Project, they compile data for airstrikes, missile strikes in Yemen. They started tracking, Saudi airstrikes during that war, and now they've been tracking the U.S. and British strikes. And I actually covered this round of airstrikes when it happened, but it wasn't clear if who was killed were civilians or not. But according to the Yemen Data Project, which is usually very conservative in their estimates, they said in that one day, 16 civilians were killed. And 14 civilians were killed in strikes on a Coast Guard site at a port in the Red Sea province of Hodeidah, and 2 were killed in the bombing of a radio broadcast building that was also hit in Hodeidah. And the U.S. and the U.K. have shared very little detail about the strikes. This has barely gotten any attention. It's just a massacre that has gone unnoticed. And you could look at their graph here. When the U.S. and British bombing campaign started in January, it was very heavy in January, February, March, and then towards the end of March, it de-escalated a bit, but it's continued at a steady enough pace. And then the airstrikes increased a bit in May compared to April. And then again, this is the biggest civilian casualty incident in this new bombing campaign, which has done nothing to deter the Houthis. Their attacks continue. They hit 2 ships on Saturday. And they've been very clear they're not going to stop until there's a ceasefire in Gaza and Israel lifts the siege and pulls out. But the U.S. has decided to open this new war in Yemen. They're blocking the Saudi Houthi peace deal. Again, just such little attention that this is getting. And according to the Yemen Data Project, the U.S. and the U.K. have launched a total of 171 strikes and dropped 393 munitions on Yemen in the first 141 days of this bombing campaign. And most of these strikes have been unilateral U.S. strikes. All right, the next one here, Biden to offer Saudi treaty for ties with Israel. So this one is from Kyle at the Libertarian Institute. The White House is prepared to roll out a plan that will make Saudi Arabia a Japan-style ally in exchange for Riyadh developing official ties with Tel Aviv. While the Biden administration has invested substantial effort to get the deal inked, it is likely dead on arrival because Saudi Arabia refuses to normalize with Israel. So they are saying that they'll do this if they normalize with Israel, but at this current time, the Saudis are saying that they're not going to do it. Even though, they were ready to throw the Palestinians under the bus before October 7th, but I think just, they can't afford to risk that now. That would make their people very angry, I'm sure. But the U.S. is prepared to give Saudi Arabia, a mutual defense guarantee, make them a treaty ally. It would be the first of its kind, in the region. For a defense commitment this strong. And just this comes with all sorts of risks. The Saudis don't seem interested in escalating in Yemen. They seem like it's the U.S. that's preventing the peace deal right now. But you never know, what could happen if they could get more emboldened. They did just open up ties. It seems like the Saudis don't want to. They've been turning to diplomacy with Iran, with Syria. But you never know. You give them this and things could change. And again, this comes out, you remember last week I went over that report about the Saudis. They're still killing migrants at the border. And it's just that's something the U.S. is just totally ignoring. They don't want people talking about that, but they're ready to give them this strong commitment. All right, so the next one here, Israeli airstrikes kill 4 in southern Lebanon. This one is from Jason Ditz. Israeli warplanes carried out multiple airstrikes against southern Lebanon over the weekend, killing at least 4 people. 2 of them reported to be Hezbollah members. 5 civilians were also reported to be injured in the attacks. One attack struck a house in the southern town of Hula, killing the 2 Hezbollah members and wounding 3 civilians. Israel also claimed to have bombed a missile platform in Hula. And a second strike took place in the village of Ida Rune, where 2 air-to-surface missiles were fired at a marketplace, targeting a coffee shop inside a gas station. The owner of the coffee shop was killed along with a young man. So that sounds like, it says that killed 2 civilians. So these escalations continue. I shouldn't even say escalations. This has been just like a daily occurrence. Israeli airstrikes, Hezbollah rocket attacks on northern Israel. All right, so the last story here, China urges the U.S. to reflect on nuclear arms policy. So this article is from the South China Morning Post, and it is China's reaction to A concerning thing that a U.S. official said recently. So China has suggested the U.S. should reflect on its behavior and reduce its nuclear arsenal after a senior official said Washington may need more warheads. So Pranay Vadi, who's a senior director for arms control, disarmament, non-proliferation at the National Security Council, recently warned He warned that Russia, China, and North Korea are expanding their nuclear arsenals, and that they're not interested in arms control, even though the U.S. has been scrapping arms control agreements with Russia over the past few years, really the past few decades. So he said, quote, absent a change in the trajectory of the adversary arsenal, we may reach a point in the coming years where an increase from current deployed numbers is required, end quote. So he's saying that they might have to deploy more nukes. And right now, the U.S. and Russia have a cap that they set for deploying nuclear weapons. It's 1,550 nuclear weapons that they can have deployed under the New START treaty, which is technically not in force right now, but both sides have agreed to stick with that cap. They're not doing inspections. The state of arms control is in a very bad place. And the fact that you have a non-proliferation official in the White House saying that they might need to deploy more nukes is completely crazy. You would think a non-proliferation official would be, working towards non-proliferation and reducing the nuclear arsenal. So it's not good. And China responded saying that the U.S. needs to reflect on its own behavior, basically just kind of responding to the comments from the U.S. and defending China. The U.S. estimates that China has 500 nuclear warheads. I know the I forget the name of it, but one of the kind of nuclear arms control, like watchdogs, estimates that China's nuclear arsenal is like 290. The U.S. and Russia each have around 6,000. The U.S. has a little less than 6,000. Russia, I believe, a little more. That includes warheads that they say are dismantled and waiting to be destroyed. The number of active warheads that they have, the U.S. has 33,708, and Russia has 4,489, according to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. So again, very concerning to see a U.S. official talking about increasing. I mean, it's unbelievable how we got here in a few short years, it feels like, when it comes to the arms control. It's just all gone, basically. All right, so that is it for the news for today. Please go check out our Viewpoints. We have one from Daniel McAdams. The U.S.-backed Ukrainian publication releases new enemies list about the Ukrainian NGO. One from Ted Snyder, NATO when you don't want it, no NATO when you do. One from Jeanette Abu Elias, who's minding the stockpile of U.S. weapons going to Israel? One from Ian Proud, Zelensky's peace summit is just an echo chamber. Spotlight is from James Carden, why does American folly march on in Ukraine? So please go check all of that out. You could always support this show by sharing it. Tell your friends, like, subscribe, comment on YouTube or wherever you watch. If you listen to the podcast, you could leave a rating or a review, depending on where you listen. Follow antiwar.com on Instagram, on X. Follow me on Twitter or X, whatever you call it. I'll be back tomorrow with some more news. Thanks for listening.